Psalm 2. Why do the heathen rage? 1. Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? 2. The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, 3. Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. 4. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, the Lord shall have them in derision. 5. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath, and vex them in his sore displeasure. 6. Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. 7. I will declare the decree, the Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. 8. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. 9. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. 10. Be wise now, therefore, O you kings, be instructed, you judges of the earth. 11. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. 12. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in him. You know, it takes more than one reading to really get what's being said here. I'll talk about certain aspects, and if you read it over again later, I think it will take on more meaning. This is the first of the so-called Masonic Psalms, those thought to describe the Messiah. Originally, it was probably a coronation song used at the inauguration of a new king of Israel. Interpreted eschatologically, it is taken to refer to the future Messianic kingdom, which, in Christian terms, would arrive at the second coming of Christ. The early Christian fathers interpreted this psalm as referring to Christ. For the Jews, it would be associated with the Messiah to be. The Messianic symbolism, without going into all the sources, there are two aspects of the Messiah. Messiah ben Joseph and Messiah ben David. Another way of putting it is that the Messiah is split and comes twice. The first coming, Messiah ben Joseph, is with persecution, humiliation, and apparent defeat. The second coming, Messiah ben David, is in glory, victory, judgment, and final fulfillment. Psalm 2 is a psalm of the second advent of the Messiah. On the other hand, Psalm 22, which we will get to later, is a Masonic psalm concerning the first advent. Psychologically, Psalm 2 describes the inauguration in the psyche of the inner authority, the transpersonal king. The secular aspect of the ego, in Hebrew, goyim, translated as Gentiles or heathen, cannot stand initially to be ruled by anything other than itself. But the Messiah has come and has subordinated the heathen king, the secular ego, to its authority. So the heathen rage against being subordinated. They rage against the coming of the Messiah. While the raging of the heathen at the coming of the self, that's a well-known phenomenon in analytic work, I can assure you, because the inner transpersonal authority so often interdicts certain desires of the ego. The ego cannot have things the way it wants. It wants a vain thing. In terms of verse 1, the early experiences of the self, the supraordinate authority within the psyche, are an offense to the ego. The willful ego, therefore, when it encounters such an experience, rages against being subordinated. I cannot overemphasize how common this experience is. It is everywhere, within oneself and without. You won't get through this day without seeing an example of it, either inside or outside or both. For the ego is an intolerable bondage whose bands and cords must be broken. Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. That's what verse 3 says. But as this psalm makes clear, once the Messiah has come, which means in psychological terms, when the self has really been constellated, these events don't take place until that constellation, that activation has occurred. When it does in fact come, then the willful protestations of the ego will not prevail. In verse 7, the newly anointed king announces the message that he has received from God. The Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. There is an interesting sidelight about this passage which is psychologically relevant. It became a major proof text for the so-called adoptionist Christology. According to this doctrine, Jesus is regarded as the man whom God has elected for his own, the one in whom the deity or the Spirit of God dwelt, and who, after being tested, was adopted by God and endowed with full dominion. This adoption took place at the baptism of Jesus, when the voice from heaven said, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Certain commenters consider that remark to derive from Psalm 2:7. Thou art my Son, this day have I begotten thee. In a nutshell, the idea of adoptionist Christology was that at the time of his baptism, the Spirit descended on Jesus and lived out of him. Then, when it came to the crucifixion, it left him again, and he was on his own. This is just one of countless examples of how the Christian myth and its detailed elaboration are interwoven with images from the psalm. With our psychological insights, we can now understand all these images as referring to experiences of the individual in the course of individuation. Although the adoptionist Christology was fairly quickly declared heretical, from a psychological point of view, as with all heretical variants of profound mythological images, both the orthodox and the heretical views are true, but the church can't survive with that viewpoint. The human psyche, in its collective manifestation, is factionalist to the core. Individuals break up into factions and fight one another, and that's intolerable for the church. To survive in the world, the church has first of all to be concerned with its integrity, its sufficient unity. Therefore, it cannot tolerate the side-by-side existence of paradoxical contraries. The individual, however, can and should. So adoptionist Christology is just as true psychologically as is the orthodox view that God himself was incarnated in the womb of the Virgin Mary. It is part of the phenomenology of the self which reconciles opposites and is beyond rational dichotomies. Anyway, still speaking psychologically, as a result of this election experience of being adopted by the self, the secular ego is then handed over to what we might call the son of the self-oriented ego. This then leads to what the psalm in verse 8 speaks of as giving thee the heathen for thine inheritance. I take that to mean that the libido, which had been in the hands of the secular heathen ego in the form of rage, is now made available to the self-oriented ego. As that rage is assimilated, its energy becomes the inheritance of the self-oriented ego, the son. For the secular ego, of course, it feels like a last judgment. Not only feels like it, it is a last judgment because of what happens in verse 9. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. This same image is used in Revelation 2:27 to refer to the coming of the apocalyptic Christ. And he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers. The idea is that once the self has been constellated and begets its son, its representative within the individual psyche, then the vessel of the heathen ego will be broken. The image of the broken potter's vessel is depicted vividly in Jeremiah. Then Yahweh said to Jeremiah, Go and buy an earthenware jug. Take some of the elders of the people and some priests with you. Go out towards the valley of Ben Hinnom, as far as the entry of the gate of the potsherds. There proclaim the words I shall speak to you. You are to say, King of Judah, citizens of Jerusalem, listen to the word of Yahweh. Yahweh Sabaoth, the God of Israel, says this. Because of this place, I mean to drain Judah and Jerusalem of sound advice. I will make them fall by the sword before their enemies, fall by the hand of people determined to kill them. I will give their corpses as food to the birds of heaven and to the beasts of earth, and I will make this city a desolation, a derision. Every passer-by will be appalled at it and whistle in amazement at such calamity. I will make them eat the flesh of their own sons and daughters. They shall eat each other during the siege, in the shortage of which their enemies and their determination to kill them will reduce them. You are to break this jug in front of the men who are with you, and say to them, Yahweh Sabaoth says this, I am going to break this people and this city just as one breaks a potter's pot, irreparably. This is quite a big image, the deliberate breaking of a potter's vessel. It's an image of psychosis. Images of small or unimportant broken plates and broken bowls are not uncommon in dreams, and they mean that the particular containing attitude or viewpoint, a relationship perhaps, has broken. A new and presumably larger or more adequate container needs to be found for the contents. That can have auspicious implications. It can be a kind of death and rebirth if the individual is up to it. However, if in a dream a vessel of considerable import with sizable association has been broken or is cracked, that's rather ominous. The big psychological vessel for the individual is the ego, and the danger is that the ego will break under the impact of an assault from the unconscious. If that pot breaks, we have a psychosis. Psychologically, that is precisely what Jeremiah 19 is describing. Yahweh tells Jeremiah to show them an image of a psychosis. So we can think of Psalm 2, especially verse 9, as an indication of what can happen if the secular ego is not able to make the transition and cannot accept the coming of the self-oriented ego, symbolized by the Messiah. Yet breaking of the ego is an ambivalent theme. In the course of individuation, the ego has to break to some extent in order for the larger standpoint of the self to come into view. I don't think that experience can be completely avoided. There's almost always a break of some kind. The symbolism is analogous to the breaking of a bone. The break comes, and then there is a period of relative confusion, helplessness, and paralysis, just as there is with a broken bone. Afterward, if nature and circumstances are working properly, the bone heals. A callus forms at the site of the break, and it is stronger than it was before. At that site, it becomes almost unbreakable, if it mends. However, there are certain breaks which, if they are not tended to, become permanent, and then there is no possibility of mending them. Something like that also happens in the relationship of the ego to the self. The self breaks the ego's will, but if the mending takes place, the ego is then knit together by a connection to the self and is practically indestructible, because it has a transpersonal foundation. All this material derives from that statement in Psalm 2, Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance. Thou shalt break them with the rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. You see, here's how I understand the composition of the Psalms. They are the products of profound moments of religious inspiration, moments of intense personal experience on the part of the psalmist, in which the meaning of the experience wowed out of the unconscious in relevant poetic images. It almost doesn't matter to us how the ego of the psalmist understood his psalm. What we're interested in is the phenomenon itself, the creative expression of the unconscious, which describes in this vivid imagery the nature of certain fundamental psychic experiences. And now that we have the psychological viewpoint, we can approach these fruits of profound personal experience and give them psychological reference, which we were never before able. Question from the audience having to do with the adversarial phase of the ego-self relationship. Edinger. I think it varies from one individual to another, but my impression is that those who are destined for maximum psychological development are apt to have particularly intense experiences of the adversarial phase. Jung gives us an example of that in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he talks about a dream concerning his visit to Africa. It was the dream of the combat on the bridge with the Muslim prince. Jung was almost done in by that. He just barely overcame the prince, and he speaks of the aspect of the encounter with the self, in which the self is the enemy of the ego. He interprets the Muslim prince as a kind of angelic being who attacked him because Jung had trespassed on his realm. That happens when the ego presumes to go into the unconscious in order to understand it, to assimilate it to some extent. In terms of the ego's conscious categories of understanding, to the self it is a trespass. And as Jung says, angelic presences, those beings who belong to the archetypal psyche, don't know how things are in the conscious world. They need to be educated. Their initial hostility is really an indication of ignorance to some extent, but it is real hostility nonetheless, so it has to be dealt with. That is why the encounter with the unconscious requires a very canny and acute kind of attitude, not a naive and innocent one.